In our last lesson, we learned that the early pioneers were people who went out west to settle in lands that were entirely new to them. They perhaps spent months planning, purchasing supplies, and possibly selling their possessions for their new start. Many families purchased various farm animals, warm clothing, and other essential supplies to last not only the long journey, but also the first few months on their new land. One of the most important parts of planning their trip, however, was coordinating with other travelers. Often, early pioneers traveled as a large caravan. Maybe you have heard the saying, there is safety in numbers. As some of the first explorers discovered, this was all too true. Large amounts meant more protection, more resources, and a joint sense of community as they pressed on with purpose and determination toward their hopeful future. Early one morning, when the dew was still glistening on the tufts of grass, they would wake up the rest of their family and set out, usually sometime in the spring when the weather was the best. These migrations were organized for a reason. The journey was not only long, but it was also dangerous. There was no smooth pavement to ride on. The trails were nothing more than wagon ruts in the dirt made from those who had gone before. Large rocks or roots in the path could cause your wooden wagon wheel to break, which wasn't as simple of a fix as pumping up a tire. Because indigenous people and newly minted Americans had different ideas about who should live on the land, fights and skirmishes were not uncommon. High mountain passes and long desert stretches meant unpredictable and harsh weather, with only the thin layer of canvas on the wagon as a defense. And none of this accounted for the hunger if you couldn't find food, dehydration if you couldn't find water, or sickness with no doctor or medicine to help. The dangers were plentiful, but a new start was calling, and for many this call was irresistible.
The Oregon Trail, approximately 1830s to 1870s. The Oregon Trail began in Missouri in the middle of the U.S. and went all the way up to the western side of Oregon. It might not look very far on a map, but it was a total of about 2,000 miles. Pull out your student notebooking page and let's do the math. If you drove your car 65 miles an hour for 8 hours a day, how far would you travel each day? Now, we know how many miles or kilometers we could travel each day. What should we do next? Maybe you are thinking that isn't so far after all. Remember, that doesn't include traffic, bathroom breaks, or stopping for fast food. Now, let's go back a few hundred years to the 1800s when it was wagon travel instead of zooming engines. On a good day, a family could travel about 15 miles. How many days would it take them to arrive? If you did your math right, you should be able to see that it took about 4.5 months to make that journey. That's if there were no storms to hunker down through or problems along the way. Many sources say it could take as long as 6 months. That's a long time to live in a tiny wagon with your family. Early settlers had advertised the rich, wet soil and how conducive it was to farming. In 1850, the Oregon Territory passed the Oregon Land Donation Act, pushing many fence sitters over the edge and onto the trail. Some went for the chance at a new life, some for the chance to make their own way, and some for the chance to start over. Originally, the trail was used for fur trappers and indigenous peoples, or Indians like we talked about today, the missionaries, and finally the small groups of pioneers. As word got out, those groups became larger and larger. Each year, a great migration, sometimes thousands of people, gathered for the journey. Can you imagine the stomping hooves of all those horses and oxen? Of Pioneer Spotlight, the Whitman Party. This is just a little side note here. Marcus and Narcissa Whitman were among the first pioneers to travel the Oregon Trail in 1835. Their hope was to travel the trail and establish a missionary where they could share the gospel with the Indians out west. They made it as far as Fort Vancouver, Washington, and built missionary posts close to that fort. Narcissa wrote about the experience, and her writings were published out east. Several years later, the missionary funding was pulled and the Whitmans headed back east. But they proved without a doubt that the Oregon Trail could be traveled by more than just fur traders and mountain men.
Okay. While people often migrated along the Oregon Trail for the opportunities they hoped to find in the rich soil, the California Trail, which was established in 1841 to 1869, was popular among those who'd heard the rumor of gold. The California gold rush lasted about 5 years before slowly fading away as an interesting page in the history books. Thousands of people, mostly men, flocked to the West Coast thinking they might strike it rich. While this is not why everyone on the California Trail migrated, it definitely brought a sense of urgency with it, and it's sometimes called the gold fever. It is important to note that while the early years of Western expansion were dangerous and unknown, as time passed, stations were set up along the way. Guidebooks were written to help travelers prepare and know what to expect. The early pioneers paved the way for those who would follow them, sharing their wisdom and the lessons they had learned. The Mormon Trail, which was between 1846 and 1847. Just like people immigrated to the United States for different reasons, they chose to risk the perils of the journey west for different reasons as well. While some were possibly smitten with the prospect of land they could own and others sought gold or a change in circumstances, there was a third reason that people went west: religious freedom. In 1844, Joseph Smith, a Latter-day Saint, sometimes referred to as a Mormon leader, was killed. This was the spark that spurred thousands to join up with the Oregon Trail and make that journey west, where they could practice their faith without interference. It later became known as the Mormon Trail. Beginning in Illinois and going all the way to Utah, it took about 3 months for them to arrive at their new home. While the motivations of each traveler might have varied, there was a commonality they shared as they journeyed to their new homes together. After all, after a long day of travel, some groups learned that if they placed their wagons in a circle at night, they could create a makeshift corral for their livestock to keep them safe. Weary travelers would start to fire, cook some food, and maybe listen to some fiddling or stories as the children drifted off to sleep in their parents' laps. While the journey definitely wasn't easy, most of the people who traveled west made it there. No one knows for certain how many families arrived on the eastern shore of the United States and chose to plunge forward into the Wild West. But hundreds of thousands of people made their way over the well-worn trails to what they hoped would be a better life for them all.